The American Sherman. Its reputation, a death trap, a Ronson lighter. But the data shows a different reality. For every Sherman destroyed, crew casualties were 0.3 men. For every T-34, 1.8. A tank 6 times more lethal for its own crew. Why did the most mass-produced tank become the most massive grave? The roots of the disaster were planted in the 1930s, with a shopping list. In 1930, Soviet agents bought foreign technology, a British Vickers tank, a license for the American Christie design. In Soviet hands, the Vickers became the T-26 infantry tank. The Christie suspension became the foundation for the BT series, fast, light cavalry tanks. Both were produced in enormous numbers, and both were fatally flawed. The proof came in the Winter War, 1939. Finnish anti-tank guns fire. A bright flash, the round hits, a sound like tearing metal. The thin armor of a T-26 fails. The crew inside is annihilated. These tanks were not built for a real war. The lesson was brutal. At Lake Kasan, at Kaukan Gol, in Finland, the Soviet High Command realized their entire tank fleet was obsolete. A new, universal platform was needed, with real armor and real firepower. 1944. An engineering answer finally arrived. A new 3-man turret. The commander was no longer the gunner. He was the commander. He saw the battlefield through a proper cupola with periscopes. His feet rested on a rotating floor, a basket. The turret turned and the entire crew turned with it. No more fear of legs severed by the gun breech. The weapon was a repurposed 85mm anti-aircraft gun. A dedicated gunner and loader served it. The floor of the basket quickly filled with hot brass. Spent casings from the massive shells. Ammunition dropped from 90 rounds to 50. But they could now fight back at range. By the end of the war, the factories had delivered 57,000 T-34s. Some sources cite a total of 80,000, the most produced tank of the Second World War. But this industrial miracle concealed a mathematical catastrophe. 44,000 destroyed machines, an absolute anti-record. This figure represents more than just steel. It means over 130,000 killed and critically wounded tankers passed through the burning holes. By the time the war ended, 44,000 T-34s were confirmed lost. But even a powerful gun offered no defense in the final battles. In the rubble of cities, crews faced a new terror, a cheap, disposable infantry weapon. How did a simple tube with a charge stop entire tank columns? The Panzerfaust. Germany produced over 8 million of them. For tankers in narrow streets, every window was a threat, every corner an ambush. A blinding flash in the dark. A single soldier could destroy a 28-ton machine. The shape charge, or heat round, was brutally effective. It didn't rely on kinetic energy. Instead, an explosion focused a superheated jet of molten metal. It punched through the armor at 7,000 meters per second. Inside, this jet became a spray of incandescent shrapnel and fire. It killed more crew members per hit than a standard shell. Panzerfausts were responsible for 70% of all Soviet tank losses in the final year of the war. The 76mm gun was obsolete. Soviet engineers rushed a replacement, the T-43 project. Better armor, a new turret, but the T-43 was a dead end. Too heavy, too slow, a failure. Desperate for a solution, they found a brutal workaround. They took the new 3-man turret designed for the T-43, and in February 1944, engineers widened the old T-34's turret ring and forced the new turret onto the existing hull. But this emergency refit was a direct response, a response to the systemic slaughter that began the year before. By 1942, Soviet tactics had evolved. The mindless charges of the early war were gone. Reconnaissance and artillery support became systematic. Infantry now rode the tanks directly into battle. Handles were welded to the hulls. Radios were installed across more vehicles. Losses remained high, but the attacks were coordinated. Then came the summer of 1943, the Battle of Kursk. The Germans brought their new heavy tanks to the front in numbers. Tiger I, the Panther, later the Tiger II. Even older Panzer IVs and Stug 3s now carried high-velocity 75mm guns. Suddenly, the T-34's 76mm gun was useless. A Tiger's frontal armor was 100mm thick. The Soviet shell could barely penetrate 60mm at combat range. The crews were outgunned, outranged. Any armor advantage the tank once had was gone. But the gun duels of 1943 seem like a minor issue, a distant problem. The tank's real catastrophe began on day one. Summer 1941. In that year alone, the Soviet Union lost 20,000 tanks. That number was greater than the tank fleets of every other nation on Earth combined. So where did they all disappear? German guns destroyed thousands, but the real enemy was often the machine itself. A grinding screech from the transmission. The driver fights the gear lever. It freezes. The T-34 lurches to a halt on a dusty roadside. No spare parts, no recovery vehicles. The crew had one order: destroy the machine and retreat. This was the fate of the invincible tank. For the Germans, the T-34 was a shock, but not an unsolvable one. They had learned hard lessons against British Matildas in France, 1940. Their solution was already in the field: the 88mm anti-aircraft gun. A weapon designed for bombers was turned on armor. It worked. The myth of T-34 superiority was born and died in the same summer, broken by German adaptation and its own mechanical failures. The chaos on the battlefield was matched by the ergonomic nightmare inside these early machines, a story for later. Half of all T-34s lost in 1941 were simply abandoned, broken down before the battle even began. But for the crews that reached the fight, a deadlier failure was waiting, one written in the chemistry of their own armor. The T-34's slope plate did not need to be penetrated to kill the men inside. What happened inside the cramped cabin when a kinetic shell struck the brittle steel alloy? The impact sent a shockwave through the metal. The inner face of the armor, never touched by the shell, would shatter. A high-velocity spray of steel fragments erupted through the crew compartment. It was called spalling. Shrapnel generated by your own tank. The effect was catastrophic. Soviet data showed approximately 2 men killed for every T-34 destroyed. For a 4-man crew, that was a 50% chance of death. By contrast, the American Sherman held 5 crew members. It averaged just 1 to 1.3 killed per knockout. A 26% mortality rate. If spalling didn't kill the crew, fire often did. Ammunition was crammed wherever it fit, with no protective casings. And if a fire started, the crew faced another design flaw: the fire extinguishers. They used carbon tetrachloride. The chemical would extinguish the flames. It would also fill the compartment with a choking, toxic gas. The choice was simple: stay and suffocate, or bail out under enemy fire. Some studies place the odds of an entire crew surviving a direct hit at just 20%. Surviving the initial impact was one test. The second was escape, and the T-34's design was a structural trap. For the 2 men in the turret, escape led through a single one-piece hatch, a massive slab of steel. It weighed over 200 pounds. Lifting it from below, against gravity, required impossible strength, especially inside a burning tank. The driver's situation was worse. His forward-opening hatch was notoriously difficult to operate. After a direct hit, it often jammed completely. He was sealed inside. Next to him, the bow gunner had no personal escape route, no hatch at all. His only path was through another crewman's station, a fatal design flaw. The position was eventually removed. The driver, his own exit blocked, was forced to scramble back and up through the turret. The driver scrambled upwards, into the most technically overloaded zone of the entire tank, the turret. This was a 2-man design, a relic from the earlier A-20 prototype, which was built around a much smaller 45mm gun. Soviet engineers crammed a 76mm cannon into the same turret ring. The space became a coffin. One man, the commander, had to perform 3 jobs. He commanded the tank. He observed the battlefield. He loaded the gun. How do you fight a battle when one man must find a target, load the breech, and give orders? You fight blind. The turret traverse was electric. A full rotation took just 10 seconds. The motor gave a metallic shriek. The turret spun, but the floor did not rotate with it. There was no turret basket. The crew had to physically scramble around the moving gun breech, dodging spent shell casings. The traverse handle had to be released early. The turret continued to spin from inertia, making precise aiming impossible. The official rate of fire was 5 rounds per minute. In the chaos of combat, crews managed 2. That rapid traverse speed had a cost. The crew had to watch their footing, constantly. One wrong step could shear a man's legs off against the hull. That lethal confinement was not a design flaw, it was a directive. By 1942, crew comfort was officially removed from the technical specifications. The state issued a new rule. Nothing would be changed on the T-34 unless it sped up production or cut cost. Everything not essential for the tank to drive and fire was stripped out. Optics, radios, periscopes, even paint. If there was not enough rubber for the road wheels, they went without it. The driver's seat was removed. He sat on the floor. This process of radical simplification was systematic. Armor plates were rearranged for faster welding. The complex turret was replaced with a hexagonal cast piece, quicker to produce. The cost of building a single tank dropped by 40%. The trade-off was a total abandonment of ergonomics. The results were immediate. To create a scale, Germany built just over 8,000 Panzers over the course of 6 years. At the peak of production in 1942, Soviet factories were building 1,200 T-34s every month. This industrial record was born from total logistical collapse, a direct response to the crisis of 1941. A T-34 from the Stalingrad factory, a T-34 from the Euromash plant. Their parts were not interchangeable. Where did this technical anarchy come from, where components from one machine did not fit another? The cause was a forced migration, the largest in industrial history. As the German advance threatened production, entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, shipped thousands of kilometers east, beyond the Ural Mountains, into Siberia and Kazakhstan. The cost was absolute. For over a month, tank production stopped. Completely. When it restarted, standardization was gone. Each evacuated plant used whatever materials it could find. A turret ring from one factory would not fit a hull from a neighboring one. Parts from one tank were useless for another. Workers slept beside their machines, in freezing, unfinished workshops, their entire existence reduced to keeping the lines moving. The result was a fleet of machines that only looked identical. It became practically impossible to find 2 T-34s built to the exact same specifications. Summer 1941. German anti-tank crews reported a machine that broke all the rules. Their standard 37mm cannon fired. The shell struck the unknown tank. It sparked and ricocheted, again and again. Frantic reports described firing over 25 rounds at a single target. German doctrine assumed the destruction of any European tank in 3 to 5 shots. This was impossible. Inside the T-34, the world was a deafening bell. 25 impacts, no penetration, just an ear-splitting metallic clang that hammered the crew into a state of shock. The armor held, but the men inside were deaf and blind. Why didn't the crew turn their powerful 76mm gun after the 10th hit? They couldn't see the enemy. The commander, deafened by the impacts, had no information. He squinted through a narrow slit, searching for the signal flags of his platoon leader. He was the gun's eyes, and his eyes saw nothing. The technical superiority of the armor was absolute. The tactical helplessness of the crew was total. Soviet tanks rolled into battle without a plan. They bunched together. They followed the lead vehicle blindly, copying its every move. Without individual orders, without situational awareness, the powerful 76mm gun stayed silent. The crews couldn't locate the source of the fire. Only the platoon commander's vehicle was equipped with a radio. This tactical blindness was not an accident. It was a planned outcome, the result of a system that had already destroyed its own command structure. 72 hours. That was the practical training time for new tank crews. Before fighting the most experienced armored force on the planet, how did the world's largest army lose control in weeks? Its command staff was gutted by its own state before the first shot was fired. By 1941, Stalin's purges had eliminated 35,000 Red Army officers, a decapitation strike against its own leadership. On June 22, 1941, the invasion began. There were only 900 operational T-34s. Their crews had 72 hours of instruction. This was less time than it took to properly read the technical manual for the tank's V12 diesel engine. The system was sending men to their deaths in machines they barely understood. These hastily assembled crews were ordered forward, directly into the jaws of the German Panzer spearheads. Before the summer of 1941, before the fire and the losses, there was the machine itself. On paper, its specifications were a death sentence for German tank doctrine. The T-34's 76mm gun, it fired an armor-piercing composite rigid round, a tungsten core inside a heavier shell. At 500 meters, this projectile penetrated 90 millimeters of steel. But what was the main secret to its invulnerability? The 60-degree slope of its frontal armor, sharp geometric lines, reflecting light. This angle physically doubled the effective thickness of the plate against kinetic shells. It forced projectiles to ricochet, breaking the basic ballistic principles of the 1930s. In contrast, German engineering followed a different logic. Their early tanks were boxes, flat armor plates bolted together like the Panzer III. The Soviet gun could defeat 90 millimeters of armor. The thickest plate on any operational German Panzer at the time measured 60 millimeters. But paper specifications were not enough. To prove this machine's viability, its creator, Mikhail Koshkin, had to risk his own life. The test: an extreme 2,000-kilometer run, 2 prototypes, from Kharkov to Moscow. Why this brutal off-road journey? It was the only way to silence critics within the party leadership. The project was secret. The tanks avoided roads, moving through snow and frozen mud, piercing cold, caked ice on the tracks. When they arrived in Moscow, they were battered but functional. The critics were silenced. But during the journey, Koshkin caught pneumonia. He stayed with his crew for the return trip. His health collapsed. He died in September 1940. That brutal run also exposed a critical defect in the transmission. A year later, that same defect would become a death sentence for thousands of crews. Koshkin never saw his tank fight. But Koshkin's ordeal was not an isolated act of desperation. The design of his tank was a journey through a political minefield, a system of terror. His first attempt was the A-20 prototype, sloped armor, a diesel engine. But it inherited a fatal flaw from the BT series, a complex, dual-drive system of wheels and tracks. Nobody wanted it. The idea was dropped. Why was the initial A-20 project almost buried? The concept threatened the influential lobby of KV heavy tank creators. Koshkin defended his blueprints before a hostile commission, men who saw his fast, medium tank as a direct threat to their own program. He pushed through. A new machine emerged from the fight. Its heart was a V12 diesel engine, heavy, powerful. The low, vibrating hum of its 12 cylinders shook the prototype's frame. Its weight, 28 short tons, distributed across specially designed extra-wide tracks, engineered for the deep mud and snow of the Russian landscape. It gave the tank a top speed of 33 miles per hour, a remarkable speed for its mass. The firepower was also a radical leap. The old 45mm gun was replaced. A new 76mm cannon took its place. This was not a minor upgrade. The mass of explosive filler in its high-explosive shell increased nearly threefold. The tank was not just a concept anymore. It was a weapon. A weapon built from parts whose creators were ghosts. The powerful V12 diesel was a key component, a technical masterpiece. Its chief designer, Konstantin Chelpan, had already been arrested and executed during Stalin's purges.